Today on the Perception and Action podcast, my interview with Matt Dix from the University of Portsmouth. How does anticipation behavior change as we vary the degree of perception-action coupling? What is the role of perceived affordances and action capabilities in the control of action? How do we explore the environment to learn? So it's time for a call to action. Hi everyone, this is Rob Gray from ASU and PerceptionAction.com. Welcome to the Perception and Action podcast, where I discuss how psychological research can be applied to improving performance, accelerating skill acquisition, and designing technologies. In today's episode, my interview with Matt Dix. We discuss his work looking at anticipation from an ecological perspective. How does the level of perception-action coupling change gaze behavior and anticipation? How do perceived affordances and action capabilities come into play? We then go on to discuss his really interesting work on search and exploratory behavior. Should these be treated as something different from executing an action, or does one just emerge from the other? Hope you enjoy. So today my guest is Matt Dix from the University of Portsmouth. Thanks for taking some time to join me, Matt.
Yeah, no problem, Rob. And thank you very much for the opportunity to talk.
So to start off with, I'll start with my usual question. Can you tell us a little bit about your background and how you got interested in sports and movement science?
Yeah, absolutely. So my background is that I did a sport and exercise science degree actually at Portsmouth. And I wouldn't say I did a lot of skill acquisition at all in the undergraduate program. And it was really through doing lots of football coaching that got me initially interested in topics around skill acquisition. So I think there was just things that I was doing as a coach that meant that I reflected on really how I was coaching. And yeah, you'd sort of look at learning sort of unfold in front of you in terms of the kids and their development. And it was then I stumbled upon, skill acquisition research, some of the stuff that Keith Davids had written, Mark Williams, Bruce Abernethy, and that then got me really interested. And then after I finished the Masters at Portsmouth, I went to University of Chichester, which is also south coast of England. And it was there that I started to do eye tracking research. So I was a research assistant working on a project with somebody called Tim Holder. And it was a penalty kick, sort of video occlusion type methods, so very similar to the work that Savelsberg had done around that sort of time. And I just got really, really interested in anticipation, eye movements, decision making. And it's from there that I guess it sort of set me on the path that I followed subsequently.
Yeah, and so in your research, you align pretty strongly with kind of the ecological approach and work of Gibson and the things that have followed. I always like to ask people how did you come to that approach? Was there one event or just kind of evolve over time?
Yeah, so I guess it evolved. So my situation was that I really, really enjoyed the research that I was doing in Chichester. And it was around that time that I'd also had a few friends that had been traveling. And I became interested in basically wanting to travel, but also continue further study. And so I started looking at different places internationally. And I was really keen on the idea of going to New Zealand or Australia, partly from just like a lifestyle sort of experience and seeing a different part of the world. And then also being really interested in the kind of work that Keith Davies and Chris Button were doing in New Zealand. But there was also the work that Damien Farrow, Bruce Abernethy were doing in Australia. So I was really interested in moving to that part of the world and fortunate enough to make contact with Keith and Chris and then get a scholarship to go to Otago. And so when I moved out there was already a really good group of postgrads doing research. Jai Chow, Rob Ryan, who I'm not sure if you know, Rick Shuttleworth as well. So there was a group of people doing research primarily at the time from dynamical systems theory. And then there was obviously the work that Chris and Keith had done. So I started reading a lot in that area and was potentially even going to go more down the coordination dynamics pathway. Mm-hmm. And then we were fortunate at Otago to get a mobile eye tracking system And because I had the background in doing eye tracking research previously, I got the opportunity to play around and do some pilot testing. And it was really through some of that initial pilot testing that I had some interesting observations in terms of some of the initial data that I collected. And then I wanted to try and explain that. And I think then it was those initial pilot studies that started to push me to that specific direction of ecological psychology.
Okay, that's interesting. Yeah, so you mentioned, maybe we can get into more of the details. You mentioned you did some work on anticipation. This is work, the soccer goalkeeper, right? A penalty kick.
Yeah, exactly.
And kind of the work.
Yeah.
And you kind of took a different direction than, the traditional approach is the, occlusion, temporal occlusion method, where you have a person make a verbal response. The goalkeeper might say, the ball's going left. It's a different kind of view you've taken on it. And how did that evolve from some of the eye tracking studies?
Yeah, so from the pilot, if I kind of start with the pilot testing in a way, because maybe I didn't necessarily question too much about some of those different perspectives. There was certainly the work that was already being done by the likes of Damien Farrar and Bruce Abernethy that started to try and move away from studying anticipation in the lab with those sort of predictive methods to trying to study more real-time anticipation. And basically what happened was when I started to do some pilot testing with the mobile eye tracker, what I was initially interested in was this observation that had come from some video-based temporal occlusion studies, where in terms of the eye movement search strategy that a goalkeeper would use or search pattern, was that they tend to start at the head of the penalty taker as the penalty taker approach to the ball, and then move sort of down the body, and then finally finish at the ball location. And basically what I wanted to see was if I change and vary the length of the player's run-up, what impact would that have on the search strategy? So if there was a very short run-up, would they still adopt the same search pattern but move to the ball really quickly, or would they almost kind of start midway through that pattern? And basically the pilot testing that I did, the guy that I tested spent most of the time just pretty much looking at the ball. And I was like, what are you doing? I'd had all this experience of doing video-based eye tracking, and then all of a sudden I moved to this real-time pilot testing, and I just was like, there's something wrong here. Like, you shouldn't be doing that. And then it was around that time that John van der Kamp had written his paper where he linked the sort of two visual systems perspective of Milner and Goodale to the ecological approach. And I then started to think, actually, maybe there's something in this. There's these findings these observations start to fall in line with that. So I did some more pilot testing, compared people looking at videos versus facing kicks in real time. When they were looking at videos, they were using the gaze patterns that were similar to those that Savelsberg had previously shown. But when they were then facing kicks in real time, they were doing something quite different. And I then really set about using the ecological approach to try and frame that comparison between the real-time perspective control of anticipation versus the sort of predictive video-based method.
Yeah. And then you've also done, I have a image from one of your papers that I always use in presentations, where you look at sort of the different gaze patterns. You've done work where you compare different responses, right? Kind of different levels of coupling from, a verbal response all the way to actually having the goalkeeper save the ball, and you find quite big differences there, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So what was interesting is that although it was a slightly different approach, obviously David Mann and myself were doing PhDs at around the same time, and he did used a similar method in a way with cricket batsmen, but albeit not with eye movements in his particular work, but did some really nice studies with sort of real-time occlusion paradigms, looking at how the movement response, along with the change in almost the visual information, impacts upon anticipation. And in my own work, I looked at effectively 5 conditions. So 2 of them were video based and 3 of them were real time, where you're facing a goalkeeper. And it was to try and look at the extent to which both the visual information that's available might influence anticipation, but also the response mode that's possible, and sort of took like a continuum approach to say, well, you can have video with no response, video where you move the joystick, or so the first video being a verbal response, video joystick, then a situation where you face a player but verbal response, a simulated movement where you just gesture with your arms where you think the ball will go, and then finally one where the goal was to try and stop the kick. And effectively what we saw was a shift across those 5 different conditions, from one where it's very much the eye movements primarily on the player and very little time spent at the ball, to a gradual shift more towards players spending an equivalent amount of time looking at the ball and the player, and sort of shifting gaze pattern between those 2 locations.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And so I guess, you know, as you mentioned, one explanation of this is kind of the brain areas involved in the different responses, right? Whether it's a purely explicit verbal response versus actually controlling an action. But yours is interesting because of the transition in between, right? You even find, so it's not just either or kind of response, right?
Yeah, I think sometimes, and maybe even I do this myself, often maybe now if people refer to some of the work that I did, they might highlight the comparison between the difference of video versus like real time. But actually, maybe the more interesting thing is the fact that irrespective of video or real time, it's as much about the movement response and how you pick up different visual information depending on what the response is. So if the goal is to try and stop the kick, you attend to different information in comparison to if you're just asked to predict where you think the kick will go. So it seems very much that the search for visual information changes depending on the movements that you're sort of coupling to that information.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's really interesting. And especially with this task too, because, you know, in many ways, I think people think of, you know, saving a penalty kick as kind of it's a paradigm example of being a pre-programmed response, right? Because it has to be so fast in one, you know, direction. So, I think the logic some people would have expected is you're just making a prediction to drive the motor response anyway. So you'd expect it to be the same, but clearly it isn't in terms of the way you're scanning. I think that's really interesting. And another thing I really like that you've done is you have started to kind of look at this task from affordance perspective, and in particular, really interesting taking in that kind of the action capabilities of the goalkeeper. Can you talk a little bit about the work you've done there?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, like a lot of people, one of the really interesting sort of implications of or theoretical aspects of Gibson's ecological approach is the idea of affordances. And I wanted to try and translate that perspective into sports. And what I also appreciated is perhaps how sometimes it can be really challenging to really sort of study affordances. So I think you maybe touched on it with the podcast with Andrew Wilson, but there's a lot of literature out there as well on different people have different definitions of affordances and the role or not of effectivities, and whether affordances are information-based or whether they're relational and so on. And I think one of the things that I found particularly interesting was some of Bill Warren's early research, where his argument or proposal at the time was this idea that affordances are relational in the sense that he did these experiments around body scaling and the perception of, can I pass through an aperture or not, and the fact that this can be scaled to your shoulder width. And I wanted to try and look at how you could take that relational scaling concept and apply it to the case of goalkeepers. So basically, with the fact that it is an anticipation task and there is often not much time for action, I think there's often an assumption that you have to anticipate early. But I think my argument or understanding was, well, if this is kind of an affordance-based control, then time is relative in the sense that you'll have some goalkeepers that can move quicker than others. So if goalkeeping in the penalty kick is action scaled, then it's likely that they'll move later than a goalkeeper that isn't very agile, who, in order to arrive in time to stop the ball, will have to move by comparison earlier. Mm-hmm. So one of the things that I then did as part of the PhD work was to try and develop a way of looking at this action scaling with the goalkeepers, and found a relationship between how quickly a goalkeeper could move, and then how that related into their anticipation. So in effect, sort of slower goalkeepers move earlier and faster goalkeepers move later.
Mm-hmm. And for that, were you measuring, you measured kind of the time it took them to cover, like you had them dive to one side, and the movement time was the?
Yeah, so basically I tried to get a baseline measure of how quickly each goalkeeper could move. Mm-hmm. So in fact, there's something that I've done in a study that I'm just writing up as well, where what I've done in the more recent study is just basically take a location in the goal, which is where the ball most frequently goes during penalty kicks, which is effectively the bottom corner. Mm-hmm. And then in a sort of baseline movement test, just have the goalkeepers move as quickly as possible in a self-paced sort of situation, just from the middle of the goal to contact the ball, and do this over a number of trials, and then build up a profile of how quickly each individual can move from the middle to the corner. And then that's my sort of animal or performer part of this scaling. And then I take the time that it obviously takes the ball to travel from when it's kicked, and look at effectively the scaling between those two aspects.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really interesting. I think like there's a critical point in there for me, the self-pace. So it's not the fastest reaction time you're measuring. Like it's not how quickly you can start moving, right?
No. So it's the effectively like the physical capability or action capability of each individual goalkeeper.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, and so you found that, and also, obviously there's a motivation for this for the goal. The longer you wait as a goalkeeper, the more information you're going to get about the ball's direction, right? So because we kind of know information gets more, there's more specification, right? As the longer the event unfolds, eventually, as the ball starts moving, which they really can't wait that long, can they?
Exactly.
Yeah. It gets more and more informative if you can wait a little bit longer, I think in most cases.
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
Yeah.
In a way, like the best thing a goalkeeper can do is just wait until the ball's kicked if they want to move to the right side. But if they do that, then they don't have enough time to stop the kick. So then it becomes a question of when do they move? So then timing becomes critical. And the timing of when to move, at least in some of the work that I've done, it appears to be very much in a question of, well, that timing is relative to how quickly you can move, and hence the sort of scaling in terms of affordance-based control.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't know if you would know this. It just came to mind. Do you know if distance of the penalty kicks in soccer has been constant over history? I'm always fascinated by a lot of sports seem to evolve to this relationship where you're pushing things like this to the limit, like where you have to move either really quickly after something happens or before. Like baseball's evolved to very similar. Like you can't wait to start the movements, the body movements involved in hitting a baseball until the ball's released either. It's too late. So it's kind of interesting. Yeah. Yeah,
but I think it's so. In the case of penalty kicks, I don't know really if that's ever changed. There is futsal. So futsal is like basically the indoor official version of football. And in that sport, they do have penalty kicks that are taken from two different distances.
Okay.
So this was a study that John and I did with Jose Navia, who I know he spent time with you in Birmingham. And we looked at how effectively the timing and also the eye movements of goalkeepers changed between those two different distance conditions. So one where effectively they have more time and therefore, in principle, should be more accurate in terms of anticipation than one that they have less time in terms of anticipation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's really good work. And so going to another topic, so far we've kind of been talking about perceiving to act. a lot of what interesting stuff you've been doing, especially I saw a really recent paper, is the other side of, Gibson's loop, coupling, acting to perceive, right? Talking about exploring the environment and kind of using visual search strategies. So can you tell us a little bit about the work you've done in that area?
Yeah, so one of the things that I have picked up from at least even some of my more recent reading with some of the Gibson work was this idea of almost active perception. So the emphasis he made on the perception is not really a passive thing where you wait for sort of stimulus information to hit you and then you respond, but rather it's an active process where people are out there sort of actively picking up and detecting information. And so one of some of the nice work that's been done trying to look at this sort of view of almost like active exploration is with, what we would refer to in football as scanning. Mm-hmm. So just the sort of head and body movements where you're actively searching for information and other opponents. So that's something that I've published a couple of papers on now. But I think one of the things that's interested me is that within some of that literature as well, at least the ecological psychology literature, there's been this distinction made between exploratory behavior that then seems to precede performatory behavior. So it's this idea that you explore and then you perform. And I guess my struggling with that was the idea that it's almost goes against what part of almost like the original idea of these two things aren't separate. And so a recent paper that I've published with Guillaume Hack, who's a PhD student in Rouen with Ludovic Seifer and John Kumar, is to basically try and emphasize why it's almost a bit of a false dichotomy if you take almost those two principles of exploratory and performatory behavior and then place it into sport. Because even in terms of elite sports people, our argument is that they're constantly sort of exploring and seeking for sort of almost opportunities for generating information and sort of manipulating situations, but that in itself is performatory as well. So it's quite difficult to sort of just say, oh, you explore during learning, and then once you've learned, you just perform and exploration stops. Whereas our argument is that exploration is an aspect of skill in itself.
Yeah, so maybe like a specific example I'm in my head when you're talking is like a midfielder in soccer, right? The exploratory parts, the looking around, scanning the field with your head turns and gaze, and then the performance is the actual kicking the ball or receiving, right? So you're right, it is kind of this separate. We always want to make this separation kind of that between that kind of action is subservient in a way to perception. Like you always, your argument is though those are it's better to think of those as all just one.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, because I think that one of the sort of suggestions that we maybe make as well is that if you take that distinction almost too literally, then you maybe end up in a situation where people are either studying or training exploration or exploratory behavior separate from performatory behavior, and then you're maybe back at the beginning of like people studying perception separate from action, whereas obviously there's been a big move over a number of years to say that they're not two separate things, but they're effectively reciprocal or part of the same process.
Yeah. No, I think that's really interesting. You mentioned you've kind of put a learning aspect into this. Are you talking about learning information about the environment in kind of the short term, or how does that fit in with this?
Yeah, so I think there's two or three different things that I think Guillaume himself wanted to emphasize within the paper. And I think maybe one for me that I think that I find particularly interesting is, well, what does learning look like from a perspective of sort of ecological psychology, and maybe what it might mean for perhaps sort of practice design. So I think one emphasis that has been put in some ecological psychology literature is the importance of, exploration in terms of learning to detect information, but also then in terms of the practice environment, the need for variability within the practice environment to help for the detection of information. And don't think that necessarily that some of those concepts specific to perceptual learning, at least anyway, that are there in ecological psychology have been translated that well into the perceptual learning literature in sport. So, for instance, although it's relatively well established around the benefits of variability of practice, perhaps, or differential learning, or maybe constraints-led approach, or the development of movement, I don't think the same most concepts or ideas have been well established in, for instance, the development of eye movements or gaze patterns or perception. So that's something that I feel as though there's quite a lot of gains to be made to explore how the variability of practice conditions might drive the search for an exploration for different information that hopefully then it improves somebody's anticipation or decision making.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I think, going back to your first point, we might tend to think of the exploratory behaviors as being uncoupled, or kind of almost like a security system scanning the environment. So it's not informed in any way. It's just looking at everything and taking in information about everything, which I don't think that's what actually happened. And you're right. We know from gaze behavior, skilled performers don't just look everywhere, so they can take in information about everything. And so it's a coupled, driven by information, just like the action. You're right.
Yeah,
so
exactly.
It has to be kind of trained in the same way. Yeah.
Yeah. But I think also what's been quite influential for me is that I said at the outset, when I started my PhD, I was doing a lot of the discussions that tended to go on within our sort of immediate postgraduate environment was around variability and individual differences in terms of coordination. And there's a lot of literature on this idea of, there's no such thing as maybe an optimal technique, or there might be a sort of correct technique for one individual, but in terms of developing a skill or coaching and such, that we shouldn't be looking to sort of instill this optimal technique that people should be looking to replicate. But then what I found interesting was that almost that is the point, that's the argument that gets made in a lot of eye movement or gaze patterns literature, that there is this one gaze pattern that people should converge towards. And then it throws up all sorts of different questions, because, for instance, if you think of a question of anticipation, so I'm the batsman and I'm facing a pitcher in baseball, and what the pitcher is doing is something that's variable. Well, if I just use the same gaze pattern every single time, I'm not really adapting to the information that's unfolding in that pitcher's actions. But equally, from the perspective of the pitcher, if they're using the same gaze pattern every time, is it that same gaze pattern then gives rise to many different pitching movements, or is it that for each different movement, we see a different gaze pattern? So I think that relationship between variability that's observed in movement and coordination dynamics, I don't think we have a very good sort of understanding of. Is that sort of underpinned by equivalent variability in gaze patterns, or is it that once we kind of converge on one gaze pattern, that then opens up that we can use many different movement solutions? I think that is something that is a really important question, but I don't think we've necessarily got a good handle on that in the literature yet.
Yeah. And I know some of the, the training work, other than the quiet eye, which there's something that I think there's probably individual variability within that even, but that's kind of good. But I know there's been a few studies where they've actually tried to train novices to adopt, some gaze pattern of an expert. And from what I remember, they've been really not worked at all, right? Where if you try to get a goalkeeper to, like you said, look on the body, then move here, then move there, really explicitly, it doesn't really work very well at all when you try to train someone like that.
Yeah. I think that one of the interesting things with some of the quiet eye literature is that if you look at some of the observational literature, there's what's referred to as the mixed observation practice, where, for instance, you might observe like a movement pattern of a skilled person and a movement pattern of a novice, and it's through the exposure to demonstrations of those most like two types that seems to be helpful for people during learning. And to a certain extent, that's almost what the quiet eye training method is replicating. Often it's you have a template of this is where you look as the novice, and then here's an example of where an expert looks, and these are some of the differences. And so whether, for instance, with quiet eye training, if you took away the opportunity to see what you're looking at and all you see is an expert, potentially then you don't really get the benefit of that observation of try and copy the expert template. There's maybe the sort of differentiation between the different gaze patterns that is helpful for the learner. But as I said, it's some of those interesting questions that I think there's still quite a lot that we can understand.
Yeah, no, I agree. You're right. And I think training it with variability in practice conditions is another really interesting angle, because it goes beyond the kind of, right, the traditional way we think of that as you building up all these different, like in soccer, if I was training a midfielder, the traditional way is, we're going to build up this memory store of all these possible situations that you can remember what to do, versus, more what the ecological approach is, learning to explore, learning how to sample and how to get it for any situation. The last kind of broad topic I wanted to ask you about, Matt, is some of the perceptual motor training, the technologies that are coming out and some of the methodologies for sport. I know you've been thinking about that, and get your thoughts on kind of where we are and where we're headed in this area.
Yeah, I think that perhaps one of the things that hasn't maybe happened enough is in some of the existing literature is maybe hasn't always been most like adequate transfer tests. So, for instance, in the work that I mentioned that I'd done, where I'd compare between those different conditions between video and then real time. But then even if you take the real time condition, perhaps the mechanism or the process in terms of anticipation is quite different, even in a real time situation, in terms of whether you're doing a shadow movement or an actual movement with the goal to intercept. And often if there are transfer tests from most like video-based training, it tends to be just a shadow movement without the goal of interception. So one of the things that I don't think we necessarily really know is whether those video-based training methods alone work. And also perhaps isn't so well known is whether anything like a video-based training or VR training, whether that should be used as a supplement or as a kind of replacement for. So I know certainly that there's some really, really, really good technologies that are being used and developed by, sort of Sam Vine, Kathy Craig, and then also I think Dave Mann's doing quite a bit with them now in Amsterdam as well. And I suppose one of the things that we don't know but would be really interesting to understand is whether you can elicit benefits from that type of practice in the absence of any regular training, or is it that you only really see any benefits from it as a supplement to regular training? I think those kind of questions are ones that will be really interesting to try and understand, because whether it's sort of theoretically motivated or not, I think the reality is that a lot of those technologies they're only going to get better, and they're only going to become more accessible and used by athletes. So it makes sense to try and understand how best to use them, albeit that I don't think they'll ever replace actual physical practice.
Yeah, no, I think those are really good points. And you're right that, kind of general question of, if you train like a goalkeeper, like you mentioned, with this different pattern of eye movements, is that going to actually have benefit to the game? Most of the things we know from transfer research is the more specific, the better. But, you're right. There's lots of those questions still to ask.
The other thing is as well, just generally in terms of developing skills like anticipation and decision making, is we probably don't really have a good handle on just the actual best practice conditions, irrespective of whether they be video or VR, but even just, coaching practices almost that best elicit improvements in some of those skills, or even the time scale of the development of some of those skills. It's not uncommon, because of how challenging learning studies can be, it's not uncommon that somebody would do, understandably, maybe a learning study over the course of 4-5 weeks, and maybe half an hour to an hour in each of those sessions. But even if somebody just practice, as just playing baseball for 5 hours, would you actually get any better at it? I don't actually know. So I think they're always the really, really challenging studies to do, those longitudinal learning designs. But yeah, we still probably don't have a really good handle on exactly how long it takes for people to acquire some of those anticipation and decision-making skills.
Yeah, I think those are really good points. And yeah, my always approach, is not moving away from the idea of replacing to, I think not enough of these, the people you mentioned all are doing this, but a lot of the other companies are not taking advantage of, like, going off the field and getting, doing these technologies. One of the things it allows us to do is take advantage and implement some of the principles we were talking about earlier of motor learning, like variability. Like if I wanted to train a midfielder in VR, I can expose them to so many more variable conditions so much more easily than trying to orchestrate that on a real field somehow. So I think that makes it hard to directly compare the two types of training in a study because they're doing very different things. But I think that's where the real advantage lies for me.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess the opportunity is to expose somebody to, if you take this principle from perceptual learning from like the Gibsons of you increase the variance to enable people to detect the invariance, then the one advantage that, potentially you can have is that with whether it be VR or video it's going to be time consuming, of course, but if you can create hundreds of different situations that you can expose somebody to is going to be more beneficial than, for instance, just having 20 situations that you just show somebody repeatedly and tell them sort of where to look or what the key information is across those 20 situations. Because I think in terms of transfer, well, you become really good at anticipating and making decisions based on 20 situations, and then you go into a game and all of a sudden something different's happening, and players won't be able to adapt. So I think that opportunity to have variability in terms of practice to give people the opportunity to explore becomes really important and beneficial. Yeah. And that's, I guess, also in terms of what we were talking about earlier, kind of one of the advantages of VR over video is, get the egocentric viewpoint is probably going to be better way. If you really did want to train these exploratory search behaviors, that's probably going to be a better way to go about it. The only challenge that's there is this idea that, although I don't know whether this would ever be possible, in fact, but if you do take the point that, at least in terms of anticipation, that it's very much an interaction. So you get two tennis players playing against each other, and yes, one player will be trying to anticipate the service direction of another, but obviously as a rally unfolds, they're both the anticipator but the initiator, if you like. And so there's very much a reciprocal nature to that interaction or that perception and action between those two players. And if you have an avatar, as much as good as potentially some of the technology may be in terms of creating that avatar, how do you create the interaction that is part of the skill that unfolds in sport? Can you create avatars that adapt movements on the basis of what your participants doing or the person that you're training? I don't know, but I think that's a key aspect of skill that maybe we don't focus on enough sometimes in terms of the literature because of control and those other things. That interaction is really quite key for studying anticipation and decision making.
Yeah, I've seen this in some of the driving research I've done in driving simulator. Yeah. A lot of times you get really unnatural behaviors from your participant in terms of like cross turns or overtaking or things because the cars in the AI are really strictly follow the laws, and they don't behave interactively. They don't try to cut you off so they can beat you to the stop sign or things. So people, in turn, it makes the participant drive very unnaturally in the ways. And there's a great Gibson paper on that, Gibson and Crooks paper on that. If anyone's interested. But I guess the very last question I had for you, Matt, is what kind of things you're working on right now and you have planned for the future.
Yeah, so one of the things that I was just talking about at the end there about really wanting to try and to understand sort of skill and anticipation as an interaction. So this is something that PhD student Harry Ramsey is working on at Portsmouth with supervision also from two people in the psychology department, Lorraine Hope and Vasu Reddy. So what's quite nice about that work is that what collectively the three of us as supervisors have as a background is we've all done work in deception, albeit that I studied it in sport, Lorraine studied it in sort of criminology context, and then Vasu in child development. So we're trying to borrow ideas from the different perspectives and then study deception in sport, but from a slightly different viewpoint. And then so another two PhD students that I should just mention, because I think they're doing really interesting stuff, Reese Hunt and Liam O'Reilly. So one of the things that Reese is doing is very much in this affordance-based control literature and looking at eye movements and coordination, but perhaps with application or with application to trying to present falls and accidents in public spaces. So almost moving on to this idea of agency and invitation. So can you design, for instance, the approach to escalators or moving surfaces so that they invite a safer stepping behavior of people, so you reduce injury risk. So he's doing some really nice work with this. And then Liam, there's some, I think you mentioned it before about your background in terms of dual task research. So one of the things that we're quite interested in understanding is that perhaps traditionally there's been this almost top-down idea that if that maybe coordination is controlled from the brain. So if you do the dual task, then that almost overloads it, and then you have this negative then implication in terms of movement. And what we try to understand is, well, if you consider it more of rather than top down, but it's like a reciprocal perception action type approach, then if you have if you impact upon action, does that then impact upon the ability to do the sort of cognitive domain? And that's one of the things that we've observed in some of Liam's work. So taking, if you like, an embodied cognition, using that phrasing broadly to approach to that kind of question.
That's really interesting. I look forward to hearing that, seeing that comes out. Yeah. I've been kind of trying to think of that in different ways as well. Dual tasks. I think it's a really useful paradigm, but you're right. We've been thinking about it one particular way. So this was really great, Matt. Thanks for taking some time to talk with me.
Yeah, no problem, Rob. And thanks again for all of the work that you're doing with the podcast. It's really good to have a platform for people to share different research that not only for academics but also coaches and students. It's really good.
Thanks again for the great discussion, Matt. Remember, you can contact me at robgray@asu.edu or follow me on Twitter at ShakyWeights. To find out more about the podcast, please check out PerceptionAction.com. Finally, to support the podcast and receive bonus materials, including written transcripts, please head over to patreon.com/PerceptionAction. This is Rob Gray from ASU. Cheers for now, and keep 'em coupled.